There are over 30 different primary weapons in Helldivers 2, and each one has their own unique traits and stats. But when it comes to the ever-escalating difficulty of the Terminid front, you're going to need to make sure you have something strong to handle these pests. Which begs the question, which of these primary weapons are the best and which are the worst for facing off against these pesky bugs? Dr. Pooplove here, and that's what I'd like to find out. In this video, I will rank each of the primary weapons on a tier list, with S being the best and Poop Hater being the worst. But not just one tier list. Well, actually yes, one tier list, because today we are just focusing on the Terminids. Starting with the AR-23 Liberator, which is the base starter gun in this game. A highly accurate assault rifle with a fast fire rate and decent recoil that also has received quite a number of damage buffs. And versus the bugs, the buffs that this has gotten are quite noticeable and nice. The damage being at 80 is pretty high, and for those that might remember, this actually is the same damage that the Adjudicator used to do before that gun received a number of its own buffs. And what all this means is that the Liberator can deal with many bugs in one mag, including the hunters and warriors, and that all makes this feel pretty nice. It's not perfect though. The light armor penetration makes this not ideal for hive guards and bile spewers, and there is minimal stagger here, which means that this can struggle versus some of the more aggressive bugs. It's good though, but just not too notably special, and this makes it basically a middle of the road choice. So I will give this a high B for the bugs. But sticking to the Liberator family, we have the AR-23P Liberator Penetrator, which is a medium armor penetrating variant of the base Liberator with the trade-off of less damage. And versus the bugs, this feels decent, especially after some of the damage buffs this has received, but I can't really say it's better than the base Liberator. The medium armor penetration is nice versus the hive guards and the bile spewers, but the damage trade-off here is not really worth it, as it feels like it takes a little bit too long to kill most things. And especially not having the best stagger force can make this pretty tough when facing off against, especially the stalkers. That being said, this still feels decent, and especially I think if you want something for hive guards, I can see some justification in taking this out. But considering how many options I think you have and where this ranks to me out of all the primary weapons, I think ultimately this is going to get pushed down to a high C for the bugs. But despite having a C in its name, this next weapon is anything but. Sticking with the Liberator family, we have the AR-23C Liberator Concussive, another variant of the base Liberator, but this time with a slower fire rate, a big drum magazine, and concussive rounds that stagger enemies backwards. And for the bugs, I think this has risen quite a bit in its usefulness, moving from something that was kind of meh to a super viable and effective pick on this front. The main benefit here is the very strong stagger, which will keep the enemies off your back. Perhaps during normal missions, this aspect is not as useful as just pure hard-hitting damage, but when it comes to the gloom missions and versus the predator strain where bugs seem to be even more aggressive and difficult, you can really start to see how good this actually is. As more and more enemies try to swarm you, a single bullet with this can hold them back, including the stalkers who can otherwise be really annoying to deal with. The drum magazine also is great, allowing you to keep enemies back for a while and feel safe without needing to worry as much about reloading. Now, yes, the damage on this is a bit lower than the base Liberator, but the faster fire rate buff that this has recently received helps, and having control over the horde with the stagger allows you to make better use of other items like the Incendiary grenade, as you can push enemies into the flame. And even having something like a dog by your side is helpful, as it can dish out more of the damage for you. Ultimately, I like this a lot, and I appreciate how this is going to make you feel so untouchable. I'm giving this an A for the bugs. But switching gears a little bit, we have our first non-Liberator assault rifle, the StA-52 assault rifle, which is a kill zone themed weapon that you have to buy from the superstore for over 600 super credits, which is very high. This gun does the same damage as the base Liberator, but it has a drum magazine, giving it a much higher mag size and a higher fire rate traded off for a little bit more recoil. And for the bugs, I think this is a noticeably better option than the base Liberator, mostly because of the extra capacity that this has, which just lets you take down more bugs per mag, and even dealing with some of the heftier ones without needing to reload. The Iron Sight's first-person mode is a bit of a downside of this, as it can be a little bit harder playing at range, and the reload can be pretty significant, but I still think this is one of the better ARs for the bugs, giving you decently high damage and a lot of bullets in the mag. It feels pretty good, so I will give it a low A for the bugs. But moving back to the Liberator family, for one last weapon here, we have the AR-23A Liberator Carbine, which is very close to the base Liberator, only this has a faster fire rate and a higher recoil. And for the bugs, this does have the advantage of being able to fire off shots very quickly, which will end up shredding the bugs in no time flat so that you can keep it moving. Of course, this does struggle a bit at range, so you will need to pulse fire it depending on how far you are from your targets. But given the mostly close range nature on this front, this can just be great for killing anything that gets too close. And having a little bit of that higher damage just makes this feel better than it ever did before. I like this, and so I will give it an A for the bugs. But now we can officially move on from the Liberator family to the next assault rifle, the AR-61 Tenderizer, which is a very accurate, high damaging assault rifle with a longer reload pattern, a modifiable fire rate, and less capacity. Versus the bugs, this feels great because this dishes out a lot of damage, making you feel powerful versus most things. And being able to switch to that higher RPM means you will be able to dish out that high damage even faster, which comes much more in handy on the bug front to help you absolutely shred these guys. Although this is a great option, you will need to be careful, as you may find you run out of ammo quickly with that lower mag size. Another weird thing here is, even if you have your settings set to remembering your aiming functions, this will default to the slower RPMs whenever you respawn. So if you want to use that fast RPM mode, you will need to switch it back every time you drop in. Another drawback is the slower reload, but you can counter this by reloading a little bit early before you exhaust the whole mag. Despite some issues, this still feels really good on this front. It's a solid pick, and for that, I will give it an A for the bugs. But now we have the BR-14 Adjudicator, a high damaging, medium armor penetrating assault rifle with a high recoil. Versus the bugs, this has a good deal of good things going for it. The higher damage will help this thing tear through bugs fast, and the medium armor penetration comes in handy versus the hive guards and bile spewers. The recoil can get a little bit out of hand, of course, so you will want to manage that with some pulse firing. The capacity on this is also the lowest out of all the assault rifles, and this does not have much stagger, which can hurt versus some of the more aggressive enemies like the stalkers. These are going to be some considerations you will need to make when choosing this. This feels overall pretty great to use, and perhaps it is my favorite assault rifle out of the whole bunch just by how it feels to use. But now that a lot of the assault rifles dish out more damage and have bigger mag sizes, the Adjudicator does kind of feel a little bit like it struggles by comparison. I hate to do this for one of my favorite guns, but I think this will get a high B for the bugs. But now we need to move on from the assault rifles to the marksman rifle class. And we have the R2124 Constitution, a relic of an older time. A slow firing antique marksman rifle with high damage, medium armor penetration, and a very slow fire rate, as well as a bayonet allowing for increased melee damage when in use. And versus the bugs, this certainly does struggle quite a bit, unfortunately. While the high damage and armor penetration can hit the bugs hard, the slow fire rate and limited mag size makes it difficult to really make a dent in the horde. And while you can get some good melee out of this, including increased melee with the peak physique perk, this won't be able to defend you for too long. Now clearly this was an S tier gun years ago, but these days it's more of a ceremonial or a meme gun, meant to challenge the will and the might of the Helldivers looking to up their difficulty. As such, this gets the honor of sitting in the poop hater category, but in the most respectful way possible. Now, the next marksman rifle is actually very similar to the Constitution, but it is better. The R6 Deadeye Marksman rifle is a lever action marksman rifle with medium armor penetration, a good deal of damage, and stagger, as well as rounds reload. And this actually does the most damage out of all the marksman rifles, and in many respects, this is a Constitution variant, only with much better stats. And for the bugs, well, despite some things sounding pretty good, this is still not so great. That's a bit to be expected though, as marksman rifles with their slower fire rates tend to struggle a bit on this front. This dishes out really good damage and stagger on this front, but just requires a lot of individual targeting, which can cause you to struggle versus the horde, although this will collateral some, which can be nice. The handling on this is also not super amazing, so you may want to utilize something like the Peak Physique perk on this front, and that can help you out. Overall, it's a bit of a struggle taking this out versus the bugs, but it at least feels like a clear step up from the Constitution, so I will give it a C. But next is the R63 Diligence, which is a light armor penetrating marksman rifle with high damage and a decent fire rate. And you would not expect this to be good versus the bugs because marksman rifles really imply precision and accuracy, which doesn't really bode too well versus a horde, but I have to say I do like this. This thing has good damage, which punches through the bugs pretty well, and having that good precision means if you enjoy these types of guns, which I very much do, this can be a great choice. The main downside though is in panic situations you aren't really going to be able to be as precise, and so this may have your back a little bit less. I really do like this gun, though I recognize it's not going to be the best on this front. I will give it a B versus the bugs. And the next weapon is similar, the R63 CS Diligence Counter Sniper, which is basically a medium armor variant of the Diligence with more damage, but a smaller capacity and worse handling. For the bugs, I actually think this is quite a bit worse than the Diligence because although you have medium armor penetration, the mag size is a bit too small and the handling is kind of slow and it's just not as usable at closer ranges. Sure, if you have some distance, you can snipe pretty well with this, but that's just going to be less useful on the bug front. And I still would prefer the base Diligence if playing at longer ranges is what you want to go for. For all that, I'll give it a C for the Terminids. But moving on from the marksman rifles to the sniper class, we have the Plaz 39 Accelerator rifle, which is another kill zone crossover weapon that is a plasma sniper rifle that fires charged up bursts. And for the bugs, this one is rough. Sniping on this front was always going to be a bit of an uphill battle, but parts of the ways that this is designed just does it no favors. The worst part about this is the mag size, which runs out so fast and just makes you need to reload constantly. And even though you do have some opportunities to rack up good kills with this, it doesn't really feel like it sits on the same level as any of the other plasma type weapons in this game, which is a real shame as plasma has been one of the top weapon types in this game, and so yeah, those other ones are just going to be much better options for you. This kind of reminds me of how the Plaz Purifier used to be before it got its buffs, and it feels like one of those guns that if just given a few tweaks, it could actually be one of the strongest in the game, but until that day, this is just the purest form of poop. Poop hater category for the bugs. But now for the SMG class of weapons, and we have the MP98 Knight, the most expensive gun in the game. A super fast firing SMG, which is one-handed, so you can use this with the ballistic shield and directional shield, as well as fire while running away. Now for the bugs, I really like this a lot. Being able to run while firing is a very useful way to escape from the horde and dish out damage at the same time. But this also allows you to use it while holding objects such as the ballistic shield, and especially now that the ballistic shield blocks melee, this will give you some nice unique advantages on this front. But beyond these perks, it also just does a good deal of damage with a fast fire rate, and it actually mows down the bugs quite quickly. It overall feels pretty good, and for those reasons, I'm going to give it an A for the bugs. But now for a similar weapon, the StA-11 SMG, which is the third kill zone crossover weapon and is a high fire rate SMG. In actuality, this is pretty much a variant of the MP Knight with the same damage but a little bit less capacity and fire rate for a slightly better recoil. And for the bugs, again, I just like this a lot. With such similar stats, I find this to be at the same level as the MP Knight, and perhaps that is intentional as the Knight requires you to buy the super Citizen edition of the game, whereas the StA-11 was a free drop from the Killzone crossover. Either way, this is a solid option, and so another A for the bugs. But the next weapon is an SMG, but doesn't fully operate like one. We have the SMG-32 Reprimand, which is considered an SMG, but is not one-handed, which really takes away the most recognizable trait of this class. It has medium armor penetration and a decently high damage, and in my view is most comparable to the Adjudicator than anything else. And versus the bugs, I'm just not the hugest fan of this. As an SMG, not being one-handed, I think that makes this lose a good deal of its appeal. But the other thing is it just feels like it runs out of ammo a little bit too quickly on this front, making me constantly need to reload. Sure, the damage is very strong and it is medium armor penetrating here, but all this plus the recoil just makes this a little bit unremarkable and not something I would choose over even something like the Adjudicator. It's not horrible, just not super impressive. This gets a B for the bugs. But now for the SMG-37 Defender, which is a one-handed SMG that otherwise has very similar stats to the base Liberator, but with a slower fire rate. And for the bugs, this is good, and it gets the benefits that most SMGs have with that one-handed perk. However, I don't like this as much as the MP Knight or the StA-11, as the lower fire rate does not make this much of a bug shredder. I even think the slightly slower fire rate makes this worse than even the base Liberator, despite that gun not being one-handed. Largely, it just feels like this is taking a little bit too long to kill the bugs. It's not horrible, but I'm just not super impressed with this. I will give it a B for the bugs. But the next one we have is the SMG-72 Pummeler, which is a defender variant trading lower damage for bullets that stun targets for a small amount of time. And this often is one of those guns that people say is really bad, but I will say, especially with some of the buffs, versus the bugs, I think it feels a bit better. The stun, which now kicks in a little quicker, means that you can get these bugs off your back a little bit quicker and stop them from moving. This is especially great for the stalkers and the commanders, although I do think I prefer pushing them back like you would with the concussive versus stopping them completely. Mostly because stunning them like this does not increase your distance from the enemy, which can be tough, especially when you need to reload. Although you can use this while running away, which is another way to do that. I will say this is in a better spot, and you can even stun chargers from the back, although you do need to be spot on with all your bullets to do so. But ultimately, this just requires you to focus too much of your fire on individual targets, and I think that could be kind of counterproductive in managing an overall horde. It's better, but it's just not the best. I will give it a high B for the bugs. But moving on to the shotgun class, we have the SG-8 Punisher, which is a high damage shotgun with light armor penetration and some good stagger. Versus the bugs, that stagger actually feels pretty good, similar to the concussive, but it also dishes out a lot more damage with each shot. And this means you can kill a lot of these bugs in one shot or stagger those who may need more. Being able to reload at any time with the rounds reload perk is also pretty good, as you don't lose bullets, and also sometimes you just need to get a few quick shots off before you are done with your reload. This is very solid, and so for me it gets an A for the bugs. Next is a similar weapon, the SG-8S Slugger, which is kind of a lower damaging Punisher variant that has medium armor penetration. And despite people calling me stupid for saying that this has spread, it does have a small amount of spread. But ultimately, with the slug shots should be fired more precisely than most of the other shotguns, at least if you want to have the best results. And I will say this does decently versus the bugs, but to be honest, given that there are less medium armor enemies on this front and that this has lower damage, as well as the fact that you need to be a little bit more accurate with that smaller spread, it does ultimately feel a bit weaker than the Punisher. This does have some good stagger force though, and it does have some good range, so ultimately this will get a B for the bugs. But next is the SG-20 Halt, which is another Punisher variant with two different firing modes. Flechette for medium armor, high damage, or stun for basically no damage but a lot of stun. Now versus the bugs, I'm a little bit mixed here. The stun rounds can stun most of the bugs with one shot, leaving them frozen for a bit, and you can even stun a charger from the front, which is pretty amazing. But you will need to switch to something else, as this doesn't really do any damage. In the time it takes you to switch, the enemies can basically start moving again. So sometimes it just feels like this is really just delaying what was already going to occur. And the stun also doesn't have a ton of spread, so you often miss some enemies. But I think if you can get quick with this, you can make it very effective. The flechette rounds are also pretty good. They do medium armor penetration and have decent damage and stagger as well, so it can be a pretty effective thing versus the bugs. I think you can do well with this, but it does take some specialization in order to get the hang of this, and I do think it deserves some props for how versatile it is. While not my personal favorite, I do think this deserves some points for all that it can do. I'll give it a low A for the bugs. But now for the SG-451 Cookout, which is yet again another Punisher variant, but this time shooting out phosphorus fire pellets, which stagger enemies back and cause them to take fire damage over time. Now, this has similar benefits to the Punisher with those impactful and staggering shots, but it will also light enemies on fire. And bugs are particularly weak to the flame, which, in my view, takes this gun to the next level. I love that you can pepper shots in and let the fire do a lot of that extra damage for you, allowing you to stay mobile. And having some decent stagger makes you pretty untouchable. This also is good for the Shriekers, as the spread and fire damage allows you to pretty much get them without aiming too much, and often in one shot, allowing the fire damage to do a lot of the work for you. This is ultimately amazing on this front, and definitely it is an S top tier gun versus the bugs. But now for the SG-225 Breaker Shotgun, which is a full auto shotgun with light armor penetration. And this is decent against the bug horde, especially with that full auto firing, meaning you don't really have to time your shots that much. It also has a decent spread, and it will bypass the medium armor too and get at those weak spots, as well as some stagger force. This is good, but compared to some of the other guns on this list, it doesn't feel as amazing as it did when this game initially came out. Still strong though, I will give it an A for the bugs. Now for the SG-225 SP Breaker Spray and Pray, which is a breaker variant with lower damage but more spread. And yeah, this can be something to help you with the horde when you literally do need to spray and pray. But the damage on this still feels kind of low. And while you can dish out to multiple enemies at a time, I don't feel like this properly can spray and pray you out of a lot of situations that I otherwise think it should. I also think you just have better options in the breaker and the next gun I will discuss. So for that, I'm going to give it a B for the bugs. Our next weapon is the SG-225 IE Breaker Incendiary, and this is yet another variant of the Breaker, but with incendiary rounds and a burst firing pattern. And this is my favorite of the Breakers for the bugs. The damage over time from the fire makes this very effective versus these guys and can really make good work of the enemies. But what keeps this just shy of an S tier for me is that it doesn't have as much stagger force as something like the Cookout, which ultimately just feels like a better option on this front. This still feels great to use, but just not the absolute best. I will give it an A for the bugs. But moving on to the explosive category of guns, we have the CB9 Exploding Crossbow, which fires explosive, staggering shots and was voted by the best YouTube community ever as the best primary weapon in the game. And for the bugs, this thing has a lot going for it. It can close bug holes, it does wide explosive damage, it has a lot of damage in general, and can be shot one-handed and quicker than the closest gun to it in the Eruptor. It also dishes out some stagger with each shot, which is awesome. Overall, this is just solid, and really the biggest downside is having that slight bullet drop and that it takes a little bit more time to get to the enemy, but all that just takes a little bit of getting used to. Beyond that, I think this can serve you very well versus the bugs and just be useful in so many different situations. This is definitely an S tier for the Terminids. But now for the other explosive weapon here, the R-36 Eruptor, which is basically an explosive sniper rifle that performs heavy armor penetration and releases a bunch of shrapnel after each shot explodes. And for the bugs, this has some really good uses. The explosion followed by the shrapnel can be great for taking out a good clump of the horde, and it does feel really satisfying to use this against the bile spewers. Of course, this is also good for utility, being able to close those bug holes. And while it does have a limited range, that range is big enough that you can still use this nicely to snipe at faraway distances. Now, the heavy armor penetration on this thing definitely sets this apart, but versus bigger enemies like the Chargers, Impalers, and Bile Titans, if you're trying to use this to take them out from their armored areas instead of going for their weak spots, you're going to be trying for a while. Having this armor penetration makes this nice to have in a jam, but it's not something that's going to have as much practical use for you most of the time versus the elite enemies on this front. I will also say that this is pretty comparable to the crossbow, but with some noticeable downsides in a slower fire rate, worse handling, lower base damage, and just not being one-handed. And it's hard not to take all of that into account when rating this. This feels good, just not the best. I will give it an A for the bugs. But next we have the energy category of weapons, and the first up is the SG-8P Punisher Plasma, which is a plasma launcher shooting these arced plasma explosions. And versus the bugs, this thing is a beast. It does really well versus them, as the explosions not only take out multiple at once, but they also stagger enemies back. I also like to use the splash damage on this to hit chargers' backsides, even getting there from the front. The main downside here is it just feels like it does a little bit less damage than a lot of the other explosive weapons, and it also doesn't close bug holes. And also, as with all exploding weapons, this can be a danger if used on enemies too close. It still feels really good though. It has a decent mag size. I will give it an A for the bugs. But now for the ARC-12 Blitzer, which is sort of like a shotgun, but it dishes out electricity that staggers and hurts multiple enemies, and it has infinite ammo. And for the bugs, this is a very strong gun, and it does very well versus the horde, especially at holding them back, while also dishing out a good deal of damage. I will say a downside to this though is the time between shots can feel quite long, and can be long enough for an enemy to close the gap and get to you. Diving back while shooting is a good counter to this, as well as just staying mobile, moving in between shots can help you survive longer. While I have in the past been hesitant to give this an S tier, despite many people saying it is, I do think the introduction of more aggressive enemies like the Predator Stalkers has made the strength of this gun much more apparent. The time between shots thing still is a bit of a downside, and that probably keeps it for being a high S tier from me, but its clear effectiveness as well as that infinite ammo has convinced me that this should firmly sit as an S tier for the bugs. But now for the LAS-5 Scythe, which is a laser beam essentially that has infinite ammo and can set enemies caught in the beam on fire. Now this gun has received several buffs, but I have to say I still just don't like it that much, because you do have to hold down and focus in so much on each individual enemy in order to take them out, and it leaves you kind of single targeting enemies while the rest of the horde has an opportunity to advance on you. It also doesn't feel that powerful on anything bigger than the Warriors, and I think you're just better off with something like the LAS Rover, because you don't actually have to control it, and you can allow it to support you in providing damage, leaving you able to manage the horde a little bit better. I can see how much stronger this has become, but it's just not something that I think is going to serve you too well versus the bugs. I'm going to give it a C. But moving on to the LAS-16 Sickle, which is similar to the Scythe, only it releases laser bullets more like an assault rifle, but with infinite ammo. And versus the bugs, I am also not a huge fan. The wind-up time on this hurts your ability to react to the horde's attacks, especially if they are close. And having to focus so much on managing your coil keeps you, I think, focused too much on other things than just simply fighting. The cooldown on this is a little bit slow, low, which may make you want to reload this in the heat of battle, and that kind of defeats the purpose of one of the main benefits in its infinite ammo. This can be decent for providing some good suppressive fire at range, especially with that infinite ammo, but that's not really enough to call this a good option. And it's ultimately going to require you to have something else for the most dangerous of times, because this just does not have your back as much as I would like. For all that, I'm going to give it a C for the bugs. But what if you doubled the edge of the sickle? You would then have the LAS-17 double edge sickle, which is an overclocked version of the sickle that can fire endlessly while continuously increasing its armor penetration from light all the way to heavy, for the trade-off of also being able to hurt yourself and catch yourself on fire the longer you fire this thing. And for the bugs, I think this is a slight step up from the base sickle. You still have that wind-up time, but now you can hold your fire down for even longer durations. And you can extend that duration with things like the vitality booster and the inflammable armor set, as well as if you are prone, you can stop the fire effects the second you lay off the trigger. This also means that you can deal with things like the hive guards and even the chargers from the front if you can manage your health longer. That all being said, it's kind of a big ask to need to stim yourself so much in order to keep the damage on this thing high, especially on a front where bugs can be quite aggressive and can hurt you quite often. It's a trade-off that, while allowing for this gun to be very powerful, can also leave you in a lot of difficult spots as a result. If you can manage it well, you can make good use of this, but I can't give it the highest marks for how much sacrifice this asks of you. I will give it a B for the bugs. But now for the Plas 1 Scorcher, which is a full auto energy weapon with great handling that fires exploding plasma shots. And versus the bugs, this feels so nice to use. It takes nearly everything out so quickly and can deal with everything that comes at you. The snappy aim also allows you to get on target fast, and this is actually one of the fastest primaries to take out a charger from the butt, doing so in less than one mag. Now, this doesn't have the best mag size, but given the level of damage that this does, it still feels pretty great. Really, the only downside is if enemies get too close, the damage from this can explode in your face. But given the high damage and snappy aim, you can often prevent things from getting to that point. Overall, I just love this gun. It feels so good to use and takes out the enemies very quickly. I gotta give this an S tier for the bugs. And next is a very similar gun, the Plas 101 Purifier, which is a dynamic version of the Scorcher that shoots plasma projectiles in a fast semi-auto fashion, or can be charged up for high damaging, staggering plasma explosions. And for the bugs, this is awesome. The fast firing is really fast as long as you have a good trigger finger, and that can allow you to completely melt enemies. This is very apparent when going after the charger's butts. Similarly, you can also take out things like the impalers and the bile spewers super quickly, and that feels great. This also is pretty good for damaging the overall horde, giving you the option to conserve some ammo by charging your shots and releasing those big explosions, or just keep firing fast for good medium armor penetrating damage all over the place. The handling is a bit worse and sluggish than the Scorcher, but not enough to really be that big of an issue. I love this, and while I am biased and I like the Scorcher more, I have to recognize that this provides you with some amazing versatility. And so yes, this is an S tier for the bugs. But now for the special category of guns, and we have the Flam 66 Torture, which is a primary version of the flamethrower support weapon that can deal with heavy enemies, but it's a little bit less effective than the stratagem version. Flames, of course, really hurt the bugs, and it makes this very strong. And the awesome thing here is you can use this to even take a charger out from the front, being one of only a few weapons that can do really well versus these guys. I will say the flame damage on this feels a bit slow to take effect and doesn't go as hard as compared to the stratagem version, which just melts enemies so fast, and that can be a bit of a downside. It kind of puts you in a position where you might just want to go for the flamethrower support weapon or even the crisper as a means of being able to dish out flames while running away, and in my view it kind of makes the Torture the worst of the flamethrower options available to choose from. Either way though, this is still no slouch on the battlefield, and it's good to have as an option. I will give it an A for the bugs. And now for the JAR 5 Dominator, which is a semi-auto firing gun where each bullet packs a ton of medium armor penetrating damage and a good stagger for the trade-off of some difficult handling. And for the bugs, the handling definitely is the toughest part to deal with here, as it can take some time to try to line up your shots. But the peak physique perk is a good way to manage that. Now, when you are on target, this just feels awesome. It can one-shot a lot of the enemies, it can damage that medium armor, and it staggers enemies very well, resulting in a weapon that just feels great versus everything. You really can't go wrong if you have this with you, and so I'm going to give it a high A for the bugs. And so here we have our list. This is where the primary weapons stand when facing off against the Terminids. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Check out my Helldivers tier list playlist for more videos like these, and thank you to my YouTube members for joining the bowel movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.